Have you ever walked into a board game shop and seen two games sitting side by side that look very, very similar? Sometimes you have to do a double take to see whether what you've seen is actually real or not. There are a lot of spin-off games out there in the board gaming world, ones which either add a new theme to an existing game, or one that pushes the game into an area where they explore mechanics in a slightly different fashion. In this video, we're going to be looking at the value and the worth of spin-off or re-implementation of different games. Hi, my name's Danny. I'm an avid modern board gamer from Australia who loves sharing my passion for this hobby with you, my friends and family. Come and join me along for this journey. Hey Danny, I was doing some cleaning and I was wondering, do we really need to own two copies of Azul? Yeah. Aren't they just both the same game? They both use different patterns and they both have different shapes. Before we dive deep into this discussion, I just want to preface this by saying that I'll be looking at both sides of the value of spin-off games in our board gaming community and society. And so feel free to form your own opinion and share your opinion in the comment section below. I'm really keen to hear what your thoughts are. In this video, we're going to be defining the spin-off games or re-implemented games as basically standalone board games that have been directly inspired by the original DNA of the original game. Wingspan, one of my favorite Euro games in my entire board gaming collection. Wingspan just has that real-life nature feel of exploring birds, and often when I've gone overseas, I've thought, oh, there's that bird I've seen in the game Wingspan. And it just brings in those beautiful moments of exploring our biodiversity in the world. As you know, this channel is all about nature and board games, but also I just love the idea of the synergy that you can create with your engine building. And so when it comes to looking at spin-off board games, there are lots of things that we really don't need. What we first of all don't need is a pasted on theme. I really don't like games which have literally just taken the game and stuck a theme on top. Maybe Pokemon Splendor might be the exception, just because it works so well in that. But usually, if it's just a game which they've just resold or reskinned or repackaged into basically the same game, but maybe a little bit worse, I don't know if that's something that's gonna destroy my vision of what I loved about the original game. I guess the art or the theme would have to really enhance the visual nature of the game. You have to be quite careful when you're taking something that is beloved and refreshing it for a new audience. So what exactly is it that I think we need from a good spin-off board game? I feel like there has to be some sort of value and a space for the game on our shelf to warrant the fact that it's not going to take up the space of another game. Our shelf space is already so limited, so introducing a game that is similar in its DNA to a shelf space that's already crowded is something that's going to pose a bit of a predicament, especially if it's a theme that I particularly like. Fishspan, I'm talking about you. Another thing that we actually don't need in a spin-off is basically the same progression or the same levels of advancement that you would see in the original game. The idea that the gameplay is going to follow the exact same pattern, the same suit, and the same way is just something that, I don't know, just really doesn't appeal to me. Now, an example I'm going to bring up when it comes to repackaging games is basically Uno and all of the editions of Monopoly. And I think they release a new edition Monopoly every year with a weird twist. I think one year it was like Cheaters Edition, and another year it was like Electronic Banking Edition. Another one was like Monopoly Scrabble. Yes, I'm not lying. Monopoly Scrabble is a thing. And I think there's a few other versions of Scrabble out there. I think there's cooperative Scrabble. So I feel like when they reinvent something, the gameplay progression has to feel vastly different for me for it to be a game that's going to be valued by me. Unless the game is slightly tweaked to be better than the original game, that's probably the only time I feel that I would want to invest money in purchasing these spin-off games. And I think that's a really key factor. because these games cost a lot of money, and here in Australia it costs over like $100 usually for a game. If I'm buying two games that are vastly similar, then it's gonna be really not justified that I'm gonna buy a game that does the same thing as a game that I've already got. One of the biggest things I think spin-off games need to have is that it's gotta look fresh, and feel innovative at the same time. I should be able to set it up on the table without someone passing going, hang on a minute, is that just another Wingspan or Wingspan 3.0? I would like the game to feel like it transports me to another world, different from the original game. I'd like it to offer some strategies and mechanics and gameplay that kind of push me into an area or a decision space that I'm not normally comfortable with or familiar with, especially if I've played the base game so much. And so being fresh and feeling fresh means that, yes, even though it shares the DNA of the original game, having that fresh feeling or innovative feeling means it justifies for me in my head, yes, it warrants a place on my shelf. Yes, the mechanics here are different enough that if I play, Wyrmspan and I play Wingspan, it's gonna feel like completely different games. And that's where the big dilemma relies. How far detached should the games feel in order to be considered part of the same world, yet still inspired by the same world? Now, there are some games out there that have been repackaged in a lighter way. Think of it as Wingspan Light Edition, or maybe it's Everdell Light Edition. The Light Edition version of the games, I can definitely see its market audience. Spirit Island is an example where they recreated Spirit Island by simplifying a lot of its rules, the way the maps were set up, so that it could be sold at a much more mainstream market audience. So if you go to your local department store like Kmart or Target or Barnes & Noble, you'll be able to see some of these simplified versions of the game. So they retain the heart of the original game, but they make it so it's accessible by families and casual gamers, which I definitely can see a purpose. And I think in that regard, I think it makes sense to make a light edition for those people who just want to taste or sample the game every now and then. It's when they take a game and they water it down so much that the game really doesn't feel like a game anymore. That's when I'm like, oh, that's not really for me. Oh, I don't really know who's gonna really enjoy this game when I could just literally play the original game, which is a lot better. But I'm rarely going to own the original game as well as a light version of the game because I love the original game so much. I'm more hesitant to get a light version. There's a lot of sometimes confusion between, is the game an expansion of the base game? Is it something that you can just kind of throw together with the base game and play? And I think that's where sometimes a re-implementation of a game compared to an expansion of a game might kind of overlap a bit. I guess this was a passion project for the designers of this game, and the theme of, including fantasy dragons in this world of Wingspan was probably very inspirational, but it definitely has to feel like a 2.0. I feel like with Wyrmspan, it does some things that are better than Wingspan, but it also does some things that I'm not so keen on as well. There's this dragon guild wheel that kind of gets you certain resources, and then as you get to certain points of this kind of clock-like dial, you can then place one of your cubes to get a bonus or get points at the end of the game. And these kind of guilds change from game to game. I wasn't really particularly fond of it, even though I used it and exploited it a lot in my games, and I liked how it gave you little bonuses, but I don't know, I still liked the original resources. I liked the idea of scavenging from a dice tower, but then also having the nectar in the expansions to be able to play with the flexibility for playing certain cards. I really liked that factor of the original game. Now, one of the things that we really don't need in a spin-off game is the balancing issues from the original game to carry over to the new game. If there was a big gripe about a certain element of the original game and they release a second version of the game that's been re-implemented and carry that same flaw or same clunky mechanic over to the new game, it is a hugely missed opportunity to be able to explore how the game could be more balanced. So balancing issues really frustrate me actually, when you can clearly see that in an original game, that was a big thing that kind of swayed it towards one direction or made one particular strategy overpowered. And then for them to not be able to incorporate it into the spin-off game just kind of makes it a little bit annoying actually. I want to really experience decisions that are going to really challenge me and test me even more so than the original game. If I played Wingspan 50 times, I'm like, I know this game inside out. When I play a game like Wyrmspan, it really should challenge me more than it did with the original game because of the experience that I have with the original game, and because this is a take on the original game, my expectations going into a spin-off game is that it's going to be better. It's going to be more fun. And it might, in some ways, in my head, convince me that I don't need the original game anymore. Maybe Wyrmspan is the game that's going to replace the base game for me. And I think one small example from Wingspan is the randomness of the card draw. When you start playing with more and more bird cards, and the fact there's only 3 out there at a particular time, you pick up the card and you're like, what do I do with this card? How do I make this card fit into an engine that I've already partially built? And so I feel like in games like Wingspan, where one of the rows is dedicated to increasing your ability to draw more options and more bird cards, you know, when you go over to a game like Wyrmspan, where the card draw is probably a little bit more limiting, then that decision space becomes narrowed. Yes, it becomes more tense, but whether it allows you the freedom to build what you want, that becomes hindered a lot.
The ibis is one of the most adaptable yet surprisingly invasive birds in the urban environment. Watch as its predator, this common pigeon, gets ready to attack. Originating from the lush coastal wetlands, this new city dweller has an average wingspan of 112 to 124 centimeters. Despite this species' urbanization, there is now a new threat lurking on the horizon. The board gamer is one of the most adaptable yet surprisingly most invasive species on the social scene.
Board game? Board game. Board game. Board game. Board game, board game. Board game, board game, board game.
Despite craving human interaction, a trip into a board game shop for this species can last minutes, hours, or even days. The board gamer is a nocturnal species often playing for hours on end, reading rules, watching how to play videos, scouring the endless data, errata, reviews, run-throughs of new and old games on Board Game Geek Online. Nesting is a behavior commonly observed in this intriguing species. Watch as this gamer organizes, sleeves, and files the game away in a meticulous manner, ensuring order is always maintained.
The game is being re-implemented or introduced with a new theme. I really want to see that the synergies in the game are going to be vastly different. I want to see that the way the cards work in Wyrmspan are going to work completely differently to the way they do in Wingspan. And a lot of the mechanics in Wingspan have kind of been really fleshed out, especially when you incorporate the expansions. But yeah, the idea in Wingspan where you can lay eggs on your cards, you can spend the eggs as resources, you can cache food when another player does something, and compared to the size of your wingspan of your birds, that will trigger particular effects. I feel like Wyrmspan kind of still does the same thing. Yes, the conversion rate might be different. You only have to pay 2 resources to convert it to another resource, but you're still using eggs. You are still, caching resources. You are still activating cards. And so I don't really know where the synergy of Wyrmspan is going to be enough to push me over the edge to make me feel like, yeah, Wyrmspan goes into a different decision space. I know that the silver scales are now kind of like your action markers, and I think that's probably one of the most innovative things about this version is the fact that in the original version you had all these action cubes, but then they dwindled over time, but the power of your actions became more expanded, whereas here you can actually do things with your dragon cards that actually net you more actions and continue your turn across a round. And if you can come up with an engine that helps you to produce more of these silver scales, you can actually extend your round and the turns even when other players have all passed. What about this new version of the game introduces and invites greater variability? Is it a starting playing power? Do you control a particular faction that gives you a particular playstyle? Are there more factions? Are there different cards that work in different ways? Having that extra variability, and a great game that exemplifies this idea of changing the way cards are used, is a game called Forest Shuffle, where there are multiple parts of the card that you can slide and slot and use in different ways. And I feel like if you're going to do a 2.0 version of a game, you need to be able to invite more variability than the original game introduced. And I think that is such a pivotal thing for not only linking the game to people who've already played the base game, but also helps to stretch the game out to other people who might not have played the base game before. It's actually probably something I look for in a spin-off game. What is it about this that makes it more variable? Because part of the joy of playing board games is exploring that all the avenues that it has to offer. One of the things I think is really important for a re-implemented version of a game is for the game to look at itself from a player interactive point of view. Now, with the original Wingspan, I tended to play that with 2 players only, mainly because you kind of did your own thing. It felt a little bit multiplayer solitaire. I wasn't going to really ask, 3 other people to come along and play like a 3-hour game of Wingspan when we really didn't engage with each other. So when a new version of the game comes along, I often think, wow, is this a game that I could play with a bigger group? And so with the example of Wyrmspan, I still think that this is a game that I'd probably only play with a maximum of 2 people, maybe 3. Even with 2, by the time you thought through your turn, you're kind of already waiting for the other person to be done. And having that enhanced player interaction, or to have the player interaction feel a little bit different, is an important thing for me when I'm looking for spin-off games. Does it increase and enhance the enjoyment of interacting with the other players, which is one of the primary ways we play tabletop games? Now, I feel like there was probably a little bit of a missed opportunity with Wyrmspan. Yes, they kind of retained these 3 rows, and that is very similar to the original game, but I feel like it might have been far more advantageous to tinker with possibly the layout of how cards are played out. Maybe it could be like a pyramid effect where you play 1 card and then 2 cards and then 3 cards and then 4 cards and have it going out like a triangle. That would have, given opportunity for different types of strategies. You could have had like a spokes of a wheel where the explorer could start at the cave entrance and head along multiple spokes. And depending on the spoke, that could determine what sort of synergies you can explore. And then each of the spokes could also have columns that could be triggered, initiated, or bonuses gained. And I feel like having the board in the shape of a wing is probably something that I prefer and something I've thought about while I'm like awake when I should be sleeping at night, actually. Just thinking about how I could have made, the game a little bit different, a little bit fresher. And I just feel like, if it is going to be a spin-off game, I want it to also look quite different. Yes, have little flecks of things that remind you of the original, but not, so much that it's just going to feel like, oh, I've played this before. In this day and age, re-implementation of existing game systems is something that we have to really tap into, because there is so far that you can go where we've reached the limit of our board game design space. The idea that finding a game that feels completely fresh, completely new is something that might be rarer and rarer as time progresses. Each and every year there are hundreds of games that are released, and there's always going to be some sort of overlap between different games. This worker placement game might feel like that worker placement game. This card deck building game might feel like that card deck building game. So there's going to be overlaps that we can't avoid. There are lots of really great re-implemented spin-off games that have been released over the years. You've got Dune Imperium, and then you've got Dune Imperium Rising, which kind of is a better introduction for new gamers. You've got Imperial Settlers, which is kind of like building settlements and features, and then you've got Empires of the North, which already has pre-made decks that players can literally play right outside of the box, and it's actually a far better game than the original. Then you've got Evolution, where you're creating different species with traits, and you're trying to survive to changing food conditions. And then you've got ocean, which takes the trait building mechanic, but then introduces the depths, which is a deck of variable cards that will change how your creatures work from game to game. Then you've got games like Everdell, staple games where you're gonna build your own little village and your little tableau, and then re-implemented versions of that like Everdell Farshore, which basically just adds a new location, some boats, and a slight few tweaks to the original formula. And you've also got Pipeline, which is basically this game where you're laying tiles down and you're connecting pipes together, which then spawned Curious Cargo, a 2-player style game, which also involved transporting and fulfilling goods via pipes. And then Trailblazers, which is basically a route building game that kind of has the same kind of configuration as Pipeline, but instead you're kind of circuiting trails, looping them around as much as you can. So what do you think of re-implemented and spin-off versions of some of your favorite games? Do you think it's a little bit of a cash grab, or do you think it has a place in our board gaming hobbies as well as our board game collections? Please let me know your thoughts, share your opinions, your stories and your experiences in the comment section below. This is a safe space to chat, and I'd love to start a conversation with you. Now, if you really found this video super valuable, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel. And if you really want to see this channel grow, please head over to my Patreon page. I'd truly appreciate it. Otherwise, feel free to check out some of the hundreds of other board game content on my main YouTube page, and I see you next time for the next Board Game Sanctuary video. See you later.